everyone, and welcome to week 11. Today we will be looking at different aspects of organizational structure. So the main parts we'll be talking about are looking at governance, how nonprofit is operated or run, and then looking at who oversees nonprofits to make sure they're functioning well, and then looking at how nonprofit finances are structured. So first, when we're looking at governance, and I kind of talked about this in an earlier lecture, the two main governors of a nonprofit would be the board of the directors and then the administration of the organization. And the thing that I would like to note throughout the majority of the lecture, I'm talking about nonprofits. Just a reminder, there are other players in the social service system. So there are also for-profit agencies who are structured very differently. So they do not adhere to these same guidelines. So for most of the lecture, keep in mind that we're talking about nonprofits. So these are organizations who are specifically, have very specific tax and governing laws that allow them to function the way that they do, and they do not provide their profits to shareholders like a for-profit business would. Their profits go back into serving their mission. So it might go to staff, it might go to new programs, etc. But that's the main difference between a for-profit and a nonprofit. A lot of times they can do the exact same thing, they just do it a little differently. So when we're talking about governance for a nonprofit, the board of directors are the primary governing body of the organization. So that's your first lecture question of the day. So they're responsible for setting the policies for the organization. They kind of stipulate fiscal guidelines. So I know an organization I worked for, the board of directors was the one who kind of said we want to have $1 million of surplus at the end of the year. This is where we want our surplus to be 10% of our operating budget. They kind of set those guidelines, and the administrations were really the ones who were carrying them out. So they are holding the CEO responsible. So they're not doing the day-to-day operation. So that's really the administration. So that's the managers, the executive director, the chief executive officer. There's different names for the primary leader of the organization. A lot of times they're the executive director. The administration are hired by the board, and they serve at the pleasure of the board. So the board can fire them at any point in time, but they're the ones who are running the day-to-day operations, the administration, so the executive director or the CEO. So the administration's the one who then hires the rest of the staff and the people who report to them, but the board of directors is the boss of the administration, and they're holding the CEO accountable to make sure that they're using funds the best way possible and really directing the mission of the organization. When we're looking at oversight of nonprofits, it's important that there are entities kind of watching over them, making sure that they are functioning in ethical ways. Just because it's a nonprofit doesn't mean that they don't always do some activities that don't always align with what people would think about nonprofits. I think people always assume that nonprofits are always working to the best interest of the people that they serve, but they also have to make money. They don't have to make a profit like a for-profit business does, but they have to make money, and sometimes they might do some unethical things in the process. So that's why we have oversight for nonprofits. They need to be watched over just like any organization, because I think a lot of times when we're donating to nonprofits, we only look at the mission statement, but we have to make sure that we're looking at the impact and how the money is being used. And that's why we have these different oversight agencies. So the different bodies that provide oversight to nonprofits, the first would be accrediting bodies. So I'm sure we've heard a lot about accreditation when it comes to universities. The Masters of Social Work program at St. Louis University is accredited by the Council for Social Work Education. Nonprofits have accrediting bodies as well. So not all nonprofits kind of have accreditation, but it's not a requirement. But for them to get a lot of funds, it can be necessary. So there's different accrediting bodies, and they're setting the standards for specialized service areas. So this is much more on the program level. So they are really saying in different areas what you need to be doing. So again, there's different accrediting bodies for different types of nonprofits. For example, the Council on Quality and Leadership provides accreditation to nonprofits that serve individuals with disabilities. So they might have a list of guidelines on safety practices for having homes for individuals with developmental disabilities, versus the Council on Accreditation provides accreditation to children and families. So that accrediting body probably has some guidelines on restraint training for staff. I know that's definitely, restraint training for staff is one of the kind of the guidelines for the Council on Accreditation. So they have different stipulations depending on their service areas. But it's kind of like a check mark that this accrediting body has said that what we're doing is meeting the minimum standards or higher standards. So it's really helpful to have that accreditation depending on what area of service you are in. There's also watchdog agencies. So if you're familiar with the Better Business Bureau, so the Better Business Bureau is looking at the organizational level. So while the accrediting body is more on the program level, these watchdogs agencies are on the organizational level. So how is the organizational operating? And it's trying to provide transparency to the public. So the Better Business Bureau has a variety of accountability measures for charitable groups, and these are made public because, again, a lot of people who are donating money don't always know how the funds are being utilized. So the Better Business Bureau is really able to outline that. They have 20 standards for charitable accountability, and these are used to help donors in making their financial decisions and trying to decide who am I going to donate money to. So it helps to foster public confidence in charitable organizations. And the standards for charitable accountability look at governance and oversight. So you should have so many people on your board of directors, and this is how they should function. It looks at finances, how nonprofits use finances. So it's kind of saying that a certain percent of the money that you bring in should be spent specifically on programs. We don't want all of your money to be spent on administration. They look at fundraising as well. So how nonprofits use their funds to put on special events and how that money is kind of brought back and used to kind of support the programs and the mission of the organization. And we'll go through some of those accountability measures later in a future lecture, but it's important to be aware of what the Better Business Bureau does. So it's a watchdog agency. That's your second lecture question for the day. It is I believe it's a nonprofit, and it's kind of there to just provide some general oversight and make sure nonprofits are being effectively run. There's also government agencies, specifically the IRS. So a lot of nonprofits, they're considered a 501c3. That is their indicator of tax exempt status. So that means the nonprofit doesn't have to pay taxes. And because they don't have to pay taxes, they have to fill out a lot of paperwork to the government, to the IRS specifically, just to make sure, again, that they are being run appropriately. So the government also helps to provide some oversight on nonprofits. And the main reason they do that is because they are providing, all of this oversight. They're providing all of these tax exemptions. So they want to make sure this is a legitimate nonprofit. So those are different oversight agencies. The important thing to remember about the government agencies, another thing I want to add, because they receive tax exempt status, the government requires disclosure of certain public documents. So that's how the government agencies provide oversight. So if anyone's ever heard of a 990 form, we'll go over that later. But a 990 form essentially is a document that lists the nonprofit's financial information. So they must list this information on an annual basis. There's a website, I can't think of the name of it, but I'll post it later. There's a website you can go to and you can look up any 501c3 nonprofit organization. You can look up their financial records. The financial records are really interesting. If you work at a nonprofit, I would highly suggest looking these up. It's called GuideStar. That's the name of the website. So it's called GuideStar, GuideStar. Go to GuideStar. Look up the nonprofits you work at. Depending on the size of the nonprofit, anyone who makes over $100,000, you have to list their salary. So you can see if you work. I do not work at a large enough nonprofit that we have anyone who makes more than $100,000. But if you work at a large nonprofit and your CEO is making more than $100,000, you can figure out how much they make. You can see where the money's being spent. It's very detailed. So I would highly suggest looking at it. It can also be helpful if you're thinking about donating to certain groups, kind of where you want to put your money, because you can kind of see how the money's being spent. It's really interesting. It also forces them, in addition to filling out this 990 form, they also have to post annual reports on their website. So if you go to any nonprofit organization, they have a annual report. So I'll go through some of the annual reports later, but that has a very basic information on where they received their money and how they spent their money. The 990 form, which is a more extensive document and is not typically posted on the website, you have to go to the GuideStar page to get those. That's much more detailed. So those are oversight agencies. They're very helpful and very important for nonprofits. Okay, so then we're going to talk about finances. So you should have seen this little chart before. I had it posted in an earlier PowerPoint. So this is kind of showing where nonprofits are getting their money. So as we can see, the majority of revenue for nonprofits is coming from fees for goods and services. Okay, so that is your third lecture question of the week: fees from goods and services. So keep that in mind. What that doesn't really delineate is who's paying those fees. So a lot of nonprofits receive fees, but keep in mind that those fees aren't always being paid by the person who's receiving the services. So it doesn't mean that if I go to a nonprofit, I receive counseling, that I'm giving them a check, I'm giving them my credit card. A lot of those fees can come from different sources. So the fees might come from people like me, individuals, but it also might come from insurance. So insurance also pays for fees. So a lot of insurances, Medicaid, Medicare, private insurance companies will cover some level of counseling for individuals. So if I need mental health counseling, my insurance company is going to pay for a portion of that counseling visit. And that would still be in the same. So if I pay my $10 copay and my insurance pays $50 for my 1 hour of counseling, both of those would be combined in the fees for goods and services. So those would kind of be lumped together. The second category, we can see fees for services from government sources. So later I'll talk about privatization. And this is the idea that the government is paying nonprofit charities or for-profit organizations to provide certain services. So money from the government to cover services is a separate category. Private contributions include fundraising, any special events that they might have where they get individual donations would be comprised of private contributions. So these are general funding sources for nonprofits. The quote I would like to include, I think I got this from the book, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So this is the idea that really whoever's paying for it is really determining what's being provided. So it's important to recognize that a lot of services that are being provided by nonprofits, depending on where the money is coming from, they don't always have a ton of say in how the services are going to be provided. As I kind of mentioned earlier, the government, with privatization, the government, privatizes, especially like foster care case management. So a lot of times they'll pay nonprofits to provide the case management for kids who are in foster care. Okay, so the government has very, very clear and set guidelines on how many times the foster care case manager has to see the child, family visits, steps for family reunification. Those are set in stone. So although the nonprofit is providing the service, they are really at the whim of the state for how they're going to be operating. And we can even think about private donations. So nonprofits do have to take into consideration their large donors depending on what they're doing. So they might not want to enter into anything do anything super controversial if they think that if they have large donors who are going to pull their money if they're doing something that they don't like. They're probably going to start to tweak their services based on what this donor is willing to fund. A large entity in St. Louis County, Missouri. Sorry for those of you from Toledo. I know much more about Missouri than I do Ohio. So in St. Louis County, the Children's Service Fund is a large provider of services. So the St. Louis County Children's Service Fund, it's a St. Louis County, so it's a government-run entity. So essentially they took a percent, like they added a 1 cent sales tax, and every penny for $1 that you spend goes to this children's service fund. So it's a fund, and then the money is distributed to different mental health organizations across the county. It's a really great fund. They're able to provide a lot of great services. So they do a lot of transitional housing for homeless youth. They do a lot of counseling. So pretty much any youth in St. Louis County can get counseling, which is awesome that they have that free of charge being covered by the government. But the thing to keep in mind is that this Children's Service Fund, which pays nonprofits, so the money goes to nonprofits, they're only going to fund very specific things. So what I've seen is nonprofits are kind of coming up with these new program ideas. They're really altering their current programs to make sure that it's going to be funded by the Children's Service Fund. Because if they're not getting funded by the Children's Service Fund, they might not be able to have that program. So they have to really determine which programs they have and set them based on the individuals who are willing to fund them. So you definitely see a lot of tweaking of activities based on who's funding them. So you really have to adapt them, and you always have to consider that some causes are more fundable than others. I'm sure it's really hard for organizations, for nonprofits who provide drug treatment for drug addicts to get charitable contributions from individuals. It's not as appealing as a cause as helping kids with disabilities. So depending on what you're trying to do, it's still necessary. It's still kind of a public good. I'm sure we as social workers understand the need to provide drug treatment, but not everyone wants to donate to this cause. So certain causes are more difficult to find funds for than others. So that's why you see a lot of nonprofits in very specific areas. Other areas, you might not have as many. That's why there's probably not as many nonprofit drug treatment centers, although they are very necessary. Of course, because of all of the guidelines for different paying for fees and individual donors, it's important that there's some diversification of funds. So if you work in a nonprofit, I would highly suggest you kind of take a look at their annual report to see where the money is coming from. Because if they have one primary funding source, that doesn't really set them up well in the long term. So it's important that you kind of look at this chart and you can see that there's 6 different places that individuals can get funding from. So it's important that we have, a chunk coming from private individual donations. We have a chunk from government. We have a chunk from fees for services, and that we're diversifying so that we're setting ourselves up well in the long term. The other thing to note on private contributions, that there are nice tax incentives for donating to charity. So along with the government providing some oversight, because it's a 501c3, along with the nonprofit not having to pay taxes to the government, individuals who donate to nonprofit charities also receive some tax incentives. I'm not going to go into the nuances of tax incentives, but it helps them. So if you donate to a nonprofit, you can kind of take that tax break off when you're filling out your taxes. This is super helpful. They're getting 13%. 13% of revenue comes from these private contributions. A lot of those are linked to tax incentives. So it's important to keep in mind that with the new tax law, it doesn't overtly make changes to these tax break systems, but the new tax law, what it does is that it raises the point at which it raises the standard deduction. So I have a nice a podcast that I linked. It's 3 minutes long, super short, that discusses this in a little more detail. But essentially, the standard deduction, if you take the standard deduction, you do not take into account your charitable donations. So when you're doing your taxes, people who are higher income, who are the ones who are donating a lot of money to nonprofits, they're the ones who are itemizing. It's called itemizing your taxes. If you've been around the block a few times with individual tax returns, you probably know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, then you're probably confused. So depending on how much money you make and how much money you kind of have in different tax breaks, you might choose a standard deduction or you might choose to itemize. If you itemize, it's typically higher income individuals, and that's when you can get tax breaks for charitable donations. The new tax law has a higher standard deduction, so less people will choose to itemize, which means less people will get the tax breaks from donating to charity. So the tax law might be harmful to some nonprofits. It shouldn't put anyone out of business, but it will lower the amount of individual contributions. So watch the podcast, super short, and it might talk about that in a little more detail. Okay. So the other thing I would like to talk about is just I'm first going to go over, since we kind of talked about in general where nonprofits are getting their funding, I wanted to look at a few nonprofits in particular. So I pulled some that I work at, some of you might work at. Family Forward is one organization. So you can look at, this is where their revenue, I pulled this directly from their website. So you can see where their revenue is coming from: individual contributions, special events, United Way, their program service fees. So they're collapsing the program service fees, so that can include the government paying them for foster care case management, what they're getting from insurance companies for providing counseling services, and also if they individuals are like paying a copay for their insurance for receiving counseling. So you can kind of see that the amount that they're getting is probably pretty in line with the average nonprofit that we just looked at. The other nonprofit that I work with is very different than Family Forward. We receive no fees. It's completely free. So that means we can receive no fees from government, no fees from individuals. So we don't even have that line item. Most of the money that we bring in is through special events. So through fundraising, we have a large fundraiser coming up this Saturday. So I will apologize that is putting me a little behind on grading. So give me a little few extra days there. But we operate pretty much just based on special events and contributions, so individual donations, in comparison to a lot of other nonprofits who have much more diversification of funds. We are not nearly as diverse. Okay, I'm also pulled St. Patrick's Center, which is a homeless service provider in St. Louis, and you can see that they receive a lot more of their funds from government funding, so they receive almost 50% from government funding. Fees are a lot lower because they provide homeless services. The government provides them with general contracts to provide homeless services. They receive funding through the Department for Housing and Urban Development, through HUD. So they receive a lot more on the government funding side. 22% from individual contributions and fundraising, but a lot less from general fees because they work with homeless individuals. They're not receiving insurance for providing counseling. I would imagine a lot of their clients do not have insurance. So they receive a lot more from the government. The other thing to keep in mind, kind of when we're talking about government getting money from the government, well, what does that really look like? So this is the idea of what's called privatization. I stole this definition from the internet. It's the transfer of a business, industry, or service from public to private ownership and control. So essentially what that's saying is the government, the public, is allowing the private agencies to run additional enterprises. So the government is paying these private entities to provide services, whether that be foster care case management, nursing homes, housing for individuals with developmental disabilities. There's different ways. And contracts can be awarded to both for-profit and nonprofit companies. So it's really interesting. I would suggest going to this website, or if you're from Ohio, go to your Ohio version of it. But the thing to keep in mind is that the state of Missouri has a ton of contracts because they contract out for lots of stuff, not just social services. And that's why it goes to both for-profit and nonprofit companies. So this Missouri Buys. So Missouri Buys, let's go to Missouri Buys and see what that looks like. So Missouri Buys essentially looks at all of the contracts that people can bid on to get paid by the state for providing something. So we're gonna go to the state of Missouri bid board. So it's Missouri Buys, and you can see all of these open contracts that the U.S. has, that the state of Missouri has with other companies. So this is where they're trying to get people to bid on what they need done. And it's very diverse in what they're looking at, like rubber track rental, trash collection services, de-icing, trash collection. They're looking for a lot. So that's why we have for-profit and nonprofit. And it requires you as a nonprofit who's providing social services, you're adhering to the same system as someone who's trying to collect trash for the state of Missouri. So it's an interesting system nonetheless. So if we want to look at something that might be a little more applicable, I'm going to go to look at social services. So let's see if I can find something. Just look through this. So social services, Department of Social Services is still providing us with some trash. So one I did have pulled up, which we're going to look at here. This is the solicitation summary. So this is Missouri's bid for specialized care management. So this is specifically for foster care. So they put this out there that they're looking for an agency to provide foster care case management. You can read on here, but what they're looking for, if you look at the item specifications, it kind of looks like they're just trying to buy, rubber tracking, item, specialized care management services, contract, quantity, 1 per day. It's just interesting. It's a fixed price. It says down here, fixed price per child per day. Like we're trying to buy children in the state of Missouri. But this is what their contracts look like because this is the state. They have a very standardized process that kind of has to be applied to nonprofit and for-profit businesses alike. So that's an example. I do have this Missouri bid on that PowerPoint slide. So again, the thing to keep in mind is when we're looking at providing social services, contracting with the state of Missouri, both for-profit and nonprofit businesses can bid on the state contracts. You can be a for-profit entity and provide case management. So here's 2 examples in providing foster care case management. The first is Family Facets. So this is their website. It's a for-profit organization throughout the state of Missouri. They provide a variety of child welfare services. So you can read through these, but they provide these intensive in-home services, which is for children who are kind of coming out of foster care case management. They don't have a ton. Their website doesn't have a ton on it. Part of that's because they don't have to provide that much. We don't really know exactly what they do, versus Family Forward, where I used to work at. We looked at their annual report earlier. They have a much more intensive website in who they are, what they do, the number of people that they serve, how many volunteers they have, executive team. You can look at publications, and that's where we're going to find their annual report. And that's kind of where I went to pull the specific information on their revenues and their funding streams. So these are things that are all, again, required because they are a nonprofit charity. But they are competing against Family Forward, or Family Forward is competing against Family Facets. The names are confusing. They sound very similar. I don't think you would know right away hearing the name Family Facets, but this is a for-profit corporation. So they are competing against each other for the exact same contracts. So Family Forward used to provide intensive in-home services. They lost the contract to Family Facets. So now Family Facets provides it. So it's just an example of how we're having for-profit and nonprofit companies who are competing against each other. And that's really important to keep in mind, because the next thing we're going to look at, and this is our last slide before we look at activities, is how state contracts are awarded. So I'm going to go through this very quickly, but essentially state contracts, they have the same system, whether they're trying to find someone to provide their trash services or to provide toilet paper, versus if they're providing foster care case management. So this is the system. So they essentially complete this extremely long, what's called a request for proposal. So I have this request for a proposal linked on Blackboard, but essentially what it is it stipulates everything they're looking for. I'm not going to go through all of it, but it stipulates XYZ. You must provide all of these services, provide us with a whole list of what types of services you're going to provide, very outlined. It has to be it's going to end up being like a 100-page document that these organizations have to complete in order to get this foster care case management grant. So that's why it can be really hard for nonprofits just to take that staff time to complete these contracts. So the way that the state kind of awards the contracts, they award points. So you get so many points, and whoever has the most number of points gets the contract. So the first thing they look at is cost. So each company, just like you are trying to provide toilet paper to the state of Missouri, you're going to tell them it's going to cost me 2 cents per roll for me to provide toilet paper. Foster care case management grants are the exact same way. So they're going to say for every child who's in the foster care case system, it's going to cost us $500 to provide them with case management services. So each company who's trying to get the contract is going to stipulate how much the state is going to have to pay them for the services. So maybe it's hard to say, do nonprofits or for-profits, are they going to have a lower cost? It varies. So they're going to stipulate that, and whoever has the lowest cost is going to get a lot of points for that. The state also is going to look at the vendor's experience and reliability, the expertise of the staff. So this is where the nonprofit or the for-profit is going to provide resumes of the staff who would be providing the services. So they're going to pull the resumes from their most experienced staff who've been working for 25 years in the system. And the state is going to say that nonprofits who've been around longer or for-profits who've been around longer, staff who have more expertise in providing the services are going to get more points. The method of performance is where the state's going to evaluate, the types of services that the company is going to provide, how they're going to evaluate their services. All of that is going to be outlined by the company who's trying to get the contract. So they're going to award points based on that. The last thing that I wanted to mention is we see this MBE/WBE participation, 10 points. Okay, so that's like 5% of the points, because there's 200 points total. 5% is on this MBE, WBE participation. What that stands for is minority business enterprise or women business enterprise. So the state of Missouri kind of decided that in awarding our contracts, all of the contracts, we're going to give bonus points if the business is owned by someone who is from a racial minority background or owned by a woman. Okay, so that sounds really great when you look at it. That we're trying to award. We're trying to facilitate more minority and women-owned businesses. Really great to give them extra points. It's kind of like the idea of affirmative action. The thing to keep in mind is that nonprofits are not owned by anyone, okay? So nonprofits cannot get those 10 points. So those 10 points for being a women or minority-owned business can only go to for-profit businesses. So when I talked about earlier, looking at family facets, that is a woman-owned enterprise because it is a for-profit business and it's owned by a woman. So they were able to get those 10 points. However, the other nonprofit that I worked at that had previously had that contract is a nonprofit. So although they employ a ton of women and a ton of minorities, they can't get those points because they're not owned by anyone, because it's a nonprofit. So keep that in mind. It's a small nuance, but it is something important to keep in mind when states are awarding contracts. They really don't look at whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit. And sometimes nonprofits can be hurt in the process. I love the idea of giving bonus points to help facilitate more minority and women businesses. But this can, in social services, this can be detrimental to nonprofits. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, now we can look at our activities for the week. So these are due on the 12th. The first thing is, of course, your lecture quiz. The second thing is a reflection on part of the reading. So you should have read chapters 3 and 4 for this week. There's a case study on pages 82 to 83, which is in chapter 4 of the Furman and Geibelman text. So chapter 4 of what I attached talks about some boundaries between the executive director and the board and some volunteers. So if we're thinking about a system of shared governance where we both have a nonprofit and an executive director, how would you define the role of a CEO versus the board of directors versus volunteers? Really who has the power and who should be having the power? Write a 1/2 to 1 page reflection, so it doesn't have to be long, that kind of addresses this question, and that'll be due on the 12th. The other thing to keep in mind is that your community assessment paper is going to be due on the 19th, so that's due the following week. This is essentially a 10 to 12 page paper, so please start working on it. I'm happy to read over any rough drafts that get sent to me by April 16th. Again, I've talked about this previously. The community assessment paper is outlined under the assignment descriptions, so please read over that. I also have an example outline that I posted as well, and to email me with any questions. Okay, that is all that I have for today. I hope everyone has a great week, and I look forward to reading your community assessment papers in a few weeks. Thanks.